Hi, Dylan. Hi, Laura.
Hello.
Hey,
How are you both doing?
doing good. How are you?
Great. I'm really excited to talk to both of you today. This is a special edition of the Coffee Chat. So rather than just talking one-on-one, we've brought you both here. And to get us started, I want to do a quick round of introductions. So Laura, this is Dylan Bernard. He's on our expert advisory board. He's been a youth leader in climate activism. He's the head of content at DB Content, and he's been working in environmental justice for years. Dylan, this is Dr. Laura Cushing. She's a renowned researcher and an assistant professor studying social inequalities and exposure to environmental hazards here at UCLA. And she's also a faculty associate at Sea Solutions. The occasion for this discussion is National Public Health Week. April 8th, so each day has its own topic, and April 8th is all about galvanizing climate justice. Part of what brought us all together is, Dylan, a piece that you wrote for the center in February around climate justice. And Laura, you have spent your career working on health equity, and recently had a publication right around different environmental exposures and how they may exacerbate health inequities. So can you each tell me a little bit about your respective work in the spaces of, climate and health? So Laura.
Sure.
Thank you.
I can go first since I see I'm off mute and Dylan's still on mute. It's great to meet you, Dylan. So broadly my interests lie in environmental justice, understanding the contribution of environmental exposures to persistent health disparities along race and class lines in the US. And some of my recent work has, particularly related to climate justice. I've been working with colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley and Climate Central, and with several community-based environmental justice organizations on a project called Toxic Tides, where we are estimating flood risks at contaminated facilities, industrial facilities, due to sea level rise and what we can expect in the future in terms of potential hazards to nearby communities from the flooding of facilities that store, emit, and use toxic chemicals. And the first paper from that work came out last year, where we were actually looking at affordable housing. As we know, we have, affordable housing crisis in this country, and we wanted to understand how much that might be made worse by our rising seas. And so we actually found that the number of affordable housing units at risk of flooding due to sea level rise, it may increase up to 3 times in the next 30 years. And the work really highlights, communities where we need to be investing to protect our precious affordable housing stock. Other work has looked at oil and gas drilling and production and impacts to nearby communities. From a climate justice perspective, we really need to be transitioning away from fossil fuels, leaving oil and gas in the ground. But instead, the US has had a boom in oil and natural gas production over the last decade or so, enabled largely by these new techniques, enhanced recovery techniques, things like hydraulic fracturing, that are making it easier to get at deposits that were previously hard to get to. And so we've been looking at flaring, which is the intentional burning off of natural gas that's kind of a waste product particularly from oil drilling. And so it's mostly occurring in rural communities where there's not a lot of monitoring or reporting required of the companies to know what's going on. And so we've actually used satellite observations to measure flaring from space and quantify the number of people living nearby and flaring from oil and gas production, primarily in Texas, New Mexico, North Dakota, Montana, and found that over 500,000 people are living within 5 kilometers of flaring from oil and gas. That's a distance that in our prior work we found was associated with higher risks of preterm birth, babies being born too early, um, particularly among communities of color in Texas. That we found that in our prior work. So, this most recent study really suggests that flaring is an environmental justice issue. We found that Black, Indigenous, and people of color were more likely to live near this hazardous waste disposal process, um, and was a call for more research, but also more regulation of this practice that's really very wasteful and unnecessary. Um, and then I guess I'll just the third kind of piece that I've been working on is really focused in California, looking at what our state is doing to try to try to meet its ambitious climate goals and greenhouse gas reduction goals. So we've looked at the cap and trade program, which regulates large point sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And we've also looked at the clean vehicle rebate programs, kind of from an equity perspective. And so our early work on the cap and trade program suggested that at least in the first 3 years of the program, emissions reductions were kind of underwhelming. And actually the majority of regulated facilities had increased their emissions prior to the initiation of the trading program. And that communities of color, low-income communities, were more likely to have experienced emission increases, not just of greenhouse gases, but other hazardous pollutants that come out of, that are emitted along with the greenhouse gases from these regulated facilities. So that work, raised some red flags, and I think asks us to consider what climate justice advocates have been saying for a long time, which is, to think really hard about what is the best way to reduce greenhouse gas pollution and regulate carbon in a way that delivers not just, climate benefits, but also environmental justice and health equity benefits. So I'll stop there because I want to hear from Dillon, but that's a sampling of some of what I've been up to lately.
Amazing. Yeah, and I'm Dillon Bernard. So my time is spent on a different side around thinking through digital communications, primarily in the youth and movement space, and primarily in kind of climate justice. So as the comms director for Future Coalition, which is a national network of youth organizations and kind of organizers, we coordinated the September 20th, 2019 strikes, which saw 650,000 people strike across the country and then 7 million people worldwide. Mostly like young people. I was like in New York City and just like saw all the young people with their signs, and just like New York City got the day off from school, so that kind of helped with turnout. But yeah, I think my time has really been spent around how do we mobilize young people and adult allies to really see climate change as a crisis that it is. And as we shifted to digital, a lot of my time has really been spent around how do we do this? How do we continue the drumbeat around our messaging, but through kind of digital, and also not do it with intention, because we're like there's so much content hitting us. So I think a lot of my time has been figuring out like how do we think through social media strategy and content that really reaches people and engages people thoughtfully, using stories and the narratives of people seeing themselves. I think for me, it's kind of an interesting spot because I'm often on the other side around just like figuring out like how do we tell this. So I'm often like amplifying the stories of just like organizers who are doing the work. I'm behind my computer, but a lot of these folks are like, trying to juggle organizing between like finishing high school or being in college classes. So my goal is really to figure out like how do we mobilize an audience, the general public, to see that young people are on the front lines of the crisis, and then also ideally like organize and mobilize with us. And I think the real focus of how I approach my work is just like creating strategies and social media content and graphics and videos that really allow folks to like learn, engage, and then mobilize. And I think mobilize has meant a few different things, including just like signing this is like the bare minimum, but I do think we're trying to like get people out in the streets and get people also like shift power to young people. So folks are like designing policy. So that's really where my goal is, figuring out how do we do that, starting with the narratives that we're telling across the country.